So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's RPP Research Forum. We're glad to have you here with us this afternoon. Before we get started, let's just go over a couple of brief housekeeping items. First of all, please keep your mics muted to avoid echoing or any background noise while we're in the webinar today. And also, we prefer that you keep your camera off so that we can preserve bandwidth and make sure that the recording and the transmission is good for everyone. For questions and answers today, in lieu of actually voicing your questions, please use the chat function and a moderator will respond to your question. I expect we'll have some time at the end for you to ask some questions of our speakers, and we may ask you to unmute yourself and ask your questions at that point. This session is being recorded and the full presentations and slides will be available on the VPR website. Our forum topic today is the NIH's new data management and sharing policy, which went into effect in January. We have two distinguished speakers with us today to talk about the policy and the steps that are being taken to help our researchers comply with it. First, we're going to have Dr. Joseph Schmelz, our UT Health San Antonio Associate Vice President for Research Administration, who's going to be speaking with us about the activities of the DMS Working Group. And following Dr. Schmelz's presentation, Dr. Meredith Zozus will be joining us. Dr. Zozus is a professor, director for clinical research informatics and the clinical informatics research division chief. And she's going to speak about the DMS policy itself, what it requires, and some resources that are available to help you write your own DMS plans. We'll be looking forward to her presentation a little later, but right now, please welcome Dr. Schmelz.
Thanks so much. Glad to see we have so many people attending today, and I just have a couple of brief opening comments, and if I could bring my slides up, that would be wonderful. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Certainly a timely topic that really stretches across all of our research departments. Could you go to the next slide, please? So I wanted to bring you up to date with what we've been doing about data management and sharing and preparing the university for the implementation, which started at the end of January. The working group, whose names are up here, and really, this has been a wonderful working group. We started looking at this issue way back in the summertime, and we brought together representatives from the VPR's office, from the Office of Sponsored Programs, from the library, from IMS, and we invited many of our senior faculty that were used to doing data management and sharing. So we've had great representation. And probably the group that's done most of the heavy lifting on this is Meredith's group, and you'll hear more from Meredith after I finish these opening statements. But this has been just a wonderful working group, and they've accomplished quite a bit in the last 6 months to prepare for that. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the goals of the working group were to prepare the faculty and the staff for the implementation of the new NIH requirements for data management and sharing. For those of you that know a little bit about this topic, you may know that wasn't necessarily a brand new requirement, but many of the research grants were not subject to the rule in the past, where now they are all subject to that rule. And so we knew that there were going to be faculty and folks that support the faculty who may or may not have specific experience with developing a data management and sharing plan. And so our working group has been working almost on a weekly, if not bi-weekly basis for the last 6 months, and looking at what are the types of support that the faculty would need in developing their plans, appropriate selection of data standards, and making sure that they had resources necessary to create budgets as part of their grant application that supported data management and sharing, protecting privacy, security measures, and then monitoring compliance with the new NIH policy. I'll refer to the NIH policy. That was obviously the major change, but I do want to recognize that other federal as well as private entities have likewise come out with similar, if not identical, requirements for grant applications for sharing data. So what was different? What was different is that in addition to managing data, which researchers are very good at, there was a new requirement that the data had to be publicly shared. And so that I think is offering some unique challenges for many of us in preparing for the form and the format by which we share data for these grant-sponsored research studies. We decided as a group that we wanted to do more than just simply provide website information and leave our investigators to their own devices. We wanted to create more infrastructure and support for that. And Meredith's group really stepped up, and the library as well have stepped up to actually providing support service to the faculty that feel that they need it. Not everybody does, but where they did, we wanted to make sure that we provided that to them. And we wanted to make sure that we developed outcome measures to assess whether we were being effective and whether our customers were being satisfied. So just one more slide. So what have we done and where are we going? And this will be, Meredith, my last slide. And so you'll be on next. Hopefully you have all received the regular communications from the working group over the past 6 months. We've sent out several of them, both in the form of VPR, OSP, and library emails, website changes, newsletters. So hopefully everyone is knowledgeable about the data management and sharing policy change and the deadline that was looming large for us in January. Likewise, Dr. Zozus' team has been making the rounds to the departments and doing department level presentations and trying to address faculty questions at those department meetings. We've launched a no-cost data management and sharing consult service for those that want the additional help. Meredith's group set that up on their website and started the process for processing and assisting faculty with the development of the written plan. She's also posted self-service templates on their website. As an institution, we decided to also participate in the federal demonstration project pilot of 2 versions of the NIH template that allows the faculty to decide whether they want to be part of that pilot study and use one of the 2 versions, and then provide feedback as to whether the template was useful and helpful. The other thing that I think it does is it allows us to be at the table as many of the institutions that are dealing with us across the nation are talking in that open forum of that project. And so we're listening very intently as to what others are saying and how they're dealing with issues and how they're moving the project forward. One of the other challenges that we knew that was going to come up was that even though the NIH has several repositories that allow for special ways to share data at no cost, usually to the investigator or minimal costs, we knew that there were probably always going to be cases where faculty could not find an existing repository in which to share their data and might need other options. And so recently, our librarians have found out that the Texas Digital Library is a great solution for that. So we'll be joining that co-op that's hosted by UT Austin, and will allow us to another option for posting and sharing data for our faculty at no cost to the faculty. Single point of contact website is still under development. We hope to launch very soon. We're very close. We've established kind of the overall plan of how the website should look and mapped out the information so that investigators or faculty can quickly migrate or find the information that they need about this policy and the services that we're providing, as well as links to other locations. So a single point of contact website is on the plan. We're just a few weeks away from getting that launched. In the meantime, though, our librarians have posted a lot of good information on their website as well as Meredith's group, as I mentioned prior. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was another issue for the university is to try to keep track of where all of this data is being shared by our faculty. And recently we identified that the Pure project, which is the application that we use to host scholars at UT Health San Antonio, now has the ability to not only track faculty publications, but we'll also be able to track the data sharing platforms where faculty data can be hosted. So that will give us a good accounting of where all of this data is being shared. And I think that should be my last slide. I probably don't have a lot of information that would generate any questions at this point. So perhaps we'll just roll right into Meredith's presentation and I'll stay on the line.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, I'm hoping that I've saved sufficient time at the end for questions and discussion for folks. The other thing that I'll mention before we get started is I figured we'd probably have a mix on the call of investigators and also research team members. And so I've tried to kind of go middle of the road with general information about data sharing and the ecosystem that's developing and rationale, as well as literal kind of nuts and bolts on what a plan looks like and what you do to put one together. So holler if you have questions, and I'll try to go quick enough to leave plenty of time for discussion in case I don't hit one or both of those topics in the way that someone would have liked. All right, so without further ado, as Dr. Schmelz mentioned, on January 25th, we entered a new era, and that's an era where the NIH required a data management plan for all studies, including and in addition to data sharing. So I've got some things that I'm hoping everybody will get from the talk today, and they're really about describing kind of the rationale and kind of overarching principles of data management and data sharing, as well as the ability to identify repositories if you need to share, and to know who to call if you need help with data management and or data sharing. So before we start, I'd like to sort of talk about the rationale for doing this. So the optimist view, and really, you know, the reason why NIH is doing this is that data only have value when they're used. So sharing data should increase the number of uses of the data and thus increase the NIH's return on investment, or maybe I should say the public's return on investment for the research endeavor and the funding that produce the data. On the other hand, if you're an investigator, then there's an alternate view, and that's being stuck at the podium after a study has failed to replicate. And people are not often, but sometimes found in that situation. You know, science expects us to replicate our work, and sometimes others try to replicate our work and can't do it. And they've done it based on our publication, maybe based on data that we've shared. And so in the past, the specifics around how to document what you did, how to describe it, what to keep available, what to provide to others who are replicating studies or doing similar work, those things really weren't described well and they weren't standardized. So I'll give you an example. In the field of agroforestry, a group did a study about some impact on the forestry environment in their region. And then 10 years later, another group came and tried to replicate the study. And they got very, very different results. And it took them about 1.5 years to figure out why. And that's because the first study, they were looking at tree density and the amount of tree growth. The first study excluded any tree that was less than 4 inches in diameter, and the second one sought to include anything that was greater than 1 inch in diameter. So the details of how they selected the population to measure were very, very different and completely absent from anything that was shared in the publication. And so that study failed to replicate. So as an investigator, the one thing that's really expected today is that sufficient information is maintained so that a study can be replicated. So there's sort of a carrot and a stick. So even though the policy went into effect on January 25th, there was a lot of work leading up to this. And I'm not going to go through the whole timeline. It's mainly here for folks' reference, but this really started as an international groundswell for increasing the return on investment on data that were collected and managed with public funds. So it started internationally. In the US, the NSF was actually the first major institute to require a data management plan, and they started that in 2011. Back in 2005, the NIH had a policy. It required a data sharing plan, but not a data management plan. So we've evolved over time. Now we currently are required to have a data management plan as well with the NIH, and other funders are really jumping on the bandwagon, so much that most funding applications in the future, even outside of NSF and NIH, are probably going to require data management plans. The important thing about data sharing is that it's really two faces of the same coin. So there's the incoming, which are things about how the data were collected and managed and standardized and documented, and of course, ultimately the quality of the data. And then there's the outgoing, which is the actual sharing of the data. And starting in 2016, there were principles articulated called the FAIR principles for data sharing. And FAIR stands for making sure that data are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And important links between the incoming and the outgoing: to be findable, obviously there has to be information about the data or metadata that's documented and available on the web so it can come up in our search criteria. To be interoperable, be able to be used sort of seamlessly between systems and by different analysis packages, the data have to be standardized. And then to be reusable, in addition to standards helping reusability, data also have to be documented sufficiently for somebody else to understand them enough to use them appropriately, and also have to be of sufficient quality. So in all of these and more ways, the incoming or the goes-ins part of how data are collected and managed have a foundational and profound effect on the sharing of the data. I will say, though, that throughout history, and the paper that's up on the slide was published, I think, in 2017, there's been a real disconnect in the data management and sharing policies, especially, is really evident with NIH's, right? In 2003, 2005, NIH came out and said, hey, you have to have a data sharing plan. And they were silent on data management. So we did a little project about almost 10 years ago now. And we did a survey. We took the 3 years of funded studies at my institution at the time, and then contacted all of them to find out their requirements for data management and sharing plans. And then we analyzed all those to see exactly what they required. And we learned two things. The first thing that we learned is that there was a huge variety in the topics that the data management and sharing plans covered, required, or suggested. And then the next was that there was a profound dearth of any requirements for upstream data collection and management and processing. Those really received the lowest coverage of anything in the data management and sharing plan requirements. And so the graph at the bottom just shows there's a peak for each of the funders, that the distinct funders that was included in the study. And then the percentage is the percentage of total topics, i.e. those that received mention in any of those plans or requirements. It's the percentage of those that were mentioned by each of the specific funder. So 1 bar per funder. So you can see that the highest one, which is in the regulated therapeutic development industry, or that's the good clinical data management practices document, far exceeds the others in the percent covered. But again, that was written for the regulated pharmaceutical industry comprehensively and to meet FDA regulations, whereas a lot of these other funders are maybe individual foundations and number one, aren't regulated in that way, and number two, really probably don't have that full perspective. So the whole lack of focus on upfront data management is really kind of interesting, right? Because we might expect that if we threw a dirty diaper in a trash can, we would never expect to get a bouquet of roses out the other side. We would expect pretty much to get garbage out for the garbage that we put in. And so the history of requiring data sharing while being silent on any of the aspects of data management is really risky. And several of the repositories, the older ones, had issues with respect to usability of data that were shared in the repositories because of lack of standards and metadata for how the data were shared and a lack of emphasis on how the data were managed. So again, we've really got to keep the goes ins and the goes outs in sync if we're really going to meet the intent of the policy. So if we think about sort of those upstream things, we think about data having an origination point where there's an event of interest and it's measured or observed. Then there's an active phase for a study where data are accumulating, you're collecting data, you're cleaning data, data may be changing in response to some of the data cleaning and quality checking. And then at some point, there's an inactive phase when you lock the database and say, okay, time for the analysis. And at sort of somewhere during that inactive phase today, most data will be shared for reuse later downstream. And so we can think about that in sort of three distinct phases. The planning phase, which for us, for a grant would be pre-award, i.e. the new requirement for the data management plan pre-award. Then there's an active phase. And what do you do with the data management plan during the active phase? It can't just be that 2-page document because 2 pages could never specify all the stuff we do with data during a study. And then what do you do afterwards? Like, is it proprietary or is it important documentation that should be shared with the data? So in the data book, there's a chapter on data management plans. And I took this table from there and it breaks down what activities and what's concentrated on in a data management plan during a planning phase and during an active phase and during an inactive phase. And importantly, the data management plan is one of 3 documents that really dovetail together to completely specify how the data were defined, collected, and analyzed for a study. And those are the statistical analysis plan for the analysis, obviously, the data management plan for how data were managed after collection, and then the site management of procedures or management of operations for how the study was operationalized at the site and how the data were generated at the site. And so together, these 3 documents fully specify traceability on the data, everything that happened to the data, and fully document data. So as part of that sort of trifecta, the data management plan, its goal is to document all operations performed on data, especially if it were done for a high-profile NIH trial or for an FDA-regulated study. Importantly, the data management plan has 3 phases. It's a plan, it's a manual during the active phase, like a reference for those who are collecting and processing data. And during the inactive phase, it serves as documentation for how the data were collected and processed, and really evidences the full traceability. So somebody should be able to read a data management plan for a locked database and understand exactly what happened to the data. As such, it means that the data management plan necessarily is a living document. It's updated throughout the study. And the NIH data management and sharing policy thankfully bears that out. There's an annual review with progress reporting for the NIH award, where the program official will actually review the data management plan with the investigator and should be expecting updates to the data management plan. So the first thing to remember is, if you have a data management plan, it is never anything that's set in stone. NIH doesn't have the expectation, and neither should anybody else. As a matter of fact, the data management plan is actually one of the most effective tools for getting data consistently processed during a study, and should be updated as often as needed to reflect what's actually being done with the data. So that's the living document piece. The data management plan is also a controlled document for regulated studies. There are components of things we would normally think of as being part of a data management plan that would be considered essential documents for a regulated study or a study done under GCP. And so the data management plan also needs to be controlled because it contains those essential documents. And lastly, the data management plan, in my humble opinion, should be shared with the data. It is the documentation of everything that was done on the data, and we certainly wouldn't want to rewrite that to share the data. We would want to be sort of collecting and maintaining that all along, so that when the study is over and we're ready to share data, we just put that documentation along with the data for sharing. So I didn't want to leave the discussion of data management without covering a few good data handling pointers, and I'm not going to go over them all. I'm just going to sort of list them here on the slide for folks to go back on. There are certainly things that would deserve their own webinar or two, and if folks are interested, we can do that. But they're here for reference if you need them in the meantime. So now I'm going to go to the goes outs part. So talking about those FAIR principles. So in general, sort of at the highest level conceptually, data sharing, its purpose is secondary use. And secondary use does two things. Number one, it's using data for purposes other than those for which they were originally collected. And there have been some very famous papers that have gone on record that have said you should never use data for purposes other than those for which they were originally collected. And I will admit, it's a bit difficult, because the secondary use means you're asking things of the data that they weren't necessarily designed to support. So you have to be very careful and very vigilant when assessing data for secondary use. The second thing that secondary use does, though, to those of us that are collecting and managing the initial data for a study, is it puts new pressure and higher expectations on our data management practices. Because if we know ahead of time that data are going to be shared, we might think a little differently, for example, about how we clean the data. In the old days prior to data sharing, we prioritized data cleaning, very focused on the primary and secondary safety and efficacy endpoints of the study, and any data points that were used to uniquely identify a measurement or a patient. Well, if you're going to share data, it might be good to do some cursory level of checking over all the shared data, because it's very embarrassing to have married 5-year-olds or pregnant males in your data set. And so doing some cursory check for those is just one example of higher expectations on us. The other example of higher expectations on us is on the data documentation end. You know, in the past, it was just sort of us that collected and managed the data or ran the study that was going to be on the hook for describing what was done and answering questions about it. And so the documentation needed to be good enough to trigger our memory of what happened, and or if it was regulated, to support regulatory decision making, which would be a little more robust than memory triggering. But nonetheless, it really had, the documentation had some very specific purposes. In the context of data sharing, that's all different, because now the purpose of the documentation is to provide others the full information about the data such that they can use it appropriately. So the expectations haven't just increased, they've gone way up with data sharing. So now I want to talk about those FAIR principles. So remember, FAIR is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I referenced the paper at the bottom that published the FAIR principles, and the detail under each of these is articulated. And it's these FAIR principles that really went into making the NIH's requirements for what's a good repository. And as we'll see later, that definition of what's a good repository is a really important stake in the sand. So let's talk about these sort of individually. So with Findable, it's basically like searching on the web to find a paper or to find a YouTube video of a piece of music. It's really having sufficient metadata or data about the data that describe the data, labels, if you will, such that search engines can find the data that's shared on the web. In other words, it makes the data discoverable by machines, by computers and searches. Secondly, the metadata should be rich, should really sufficiently describe the study from different aspects. For example, we might want data on registries. Well, okay, then we might also want data from cardiovascular trials. And some of those cardiovascular trials or studies could be registries. So there's sort of two different ways in which we might search for the data, and metadata needs to be able to support that. Things like you would search for a publication, maybe by authors, maybe by topics, maybe by keywords, maybe by year in which it was published, maybe by journal. The other thing for Findable is that the metadata have to include a unique identifier. And importantly, that identifier has to be a persistent identifier. And that's one of the big roles of data repositories. The next is that the metadata have to be registered or indexed in a searchable resource. So if we think, when we need a paper, what do? We go to PubMed. Or maybe Google Scholar, but let's just say we go to PubMed. And the reason why PubMed and Google Scholar works is because when a journal publishes an article, the journal throws metadata, which is all the information that you would find in the citation or the bibliometric information about the article. So the authors, the title, the volume, the issue, all that sort of stuff. Well, it doesn't just work for publications. Now, with all the FAIR principles and the emphasis on data sharing, there's also a data citation. So when you share data through a respectable repository, that repository is indexed with an organization called DataCite, and DataCite provides that information, makes it indexable in the same way that Crossref or organizations like it do for published articles. And so the shared data is going to be findable just like publications will be. And investigators and research team members that contributed to that data can be on that data citation like an author. So you can get citations for papers that you wrote and citations for data that you shared or contributed to the sharing. So all that is in Findable. For accessible, the data need to be somewhere where others can get at them. So preferably open and free unless it's sensitive data and needs to be controlled. One of the specific things is that even after the data are gone, like if it's large data, it's expensive to share, but they find out, wow, nobody used it in 10 years. We're not going to keep paying to keep the data alive. We're going to dispose of the data. That record that the data were there, at least, is still persistent, and the repositories keep track of that. Another area of find is interoperable, and interoperable basically means machine readable or machine actionable, so that, for example, when you set up a search, when a publications comes out in this area, notify me. Well, you can do the same thing. It's that sort of machines automatically doing it and doing the alert and then letting you know, so that the metadata for shared data is traversable by machines, and machines can operate on it to do things like automatic alerts. And importantly, interoperable also means the ability to make connections that you couldn't otherwise make. So in his last slide, Dr. Schmelz mentioned software that we could have as an institution that would go out and get all of the data citations from our investigators at UT Health and put them on their faculty profiles. And we could also aggregate them and put them on the faculty page. And Dr. Goldberg shared some data about a month or a few weeks ago from one of those engines that already over 800 data sets have been shared by investigators from our institution. And the reason why we can know that with the click of a button is this interoperability thing, because that software goes out and aggregates all the information, finds it all, and then can present it. But that's not where it ends. It's not just about counting data citations. If you think about the study and the ecosystem surrounding a study, an investigator first writes a grant. Well, there's a unique identifier and some metadata for that. Then with that grant, they might be doing a clinical trial or a study. They might register it in clinicaltrials.gov. Those two things can be connected so that now when we pull up the grant, we can pretty easily pull up any of the references in clinicaltrials.gov that were funded by that grant. But it doesn't stop there, right? Because once the study is over, it might share some resources, it might share some data, and it certainly might generate some publications. Given all of that, all of those things, the shared resources, the data, the publications from a study, all of those things can be aggregatable and findable for a study and easily listed on the web under that study or under that investigator because of this thing called interoperability. And that basically requires that we all use standards for how we describe the data that are shared. But interoperability also applies to the actual data itself. So the ability to access the data and download it into your analysis package and use it, or the ability, if data are using sort of industry standards or discipline standards, and your data are in those standards and somebody else's data are in those standards, and we want to analyze them together and pool them. If the data are conformant to those standards, we can just set those data sets one on top of the other and proceed toward analysis. It doesn't mean it's automatically ready or it works 100% of the time. There are often issues, but it is far better than having data in two different formats and having to undertake, 300 or 400 hours of harmonizing and programming to get all the data in one. So the interoperability is a really big deal, and people have been working for, 30, 40 years on standards to make this happen. And the last thing that I'll mention, although we've talked about it a little bit, is reusable, in that the data are described sufficiently that others can use them. And there's detailed provenance or information about the origin of the data. The FDA and GCP go a little further, a lot further than provenance. So you can't just say the origin of the data, but you also have to specify traceability, i.e. all those operations performed on the data. And then the last thing under reusable is that if there are community or discipline specific standards, that number one, we have a clue enough to know that, and we're conscientious enough to apply those to our research. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, right? Because in industry funded studies, for example, the FDA requires submission in certain standards. So people who do industry regulated studies, they have to do that. It's a requirement. There's money in the budget to do that. For federally funded studies, not so much. Most solicitations don't require specific data standards. So for an investigator, applying data standards to their study is an extra step, and it's an extra added cost. And that's one of the things that makes data sharing and reuse more difficult, is some of these expectations that have increased on us for the upfront data management and data handling. So the one thing that I'll mention is the 1-10-100 rule, because it is true that those things are more expensive to do when you're going to share data because of the heightened expectations and the additional uses of the data. But unfortunately, FAIR is really expensive to achieve after the fact. This thing called the 1-10-100 rule, it's a rule of thumb that basically says it costs you $1 to correct something up at the source the first time you do it. it costs $10 to correct the same thing a little further downstream. And then if you're outwards toward your final product, like a published paper or an analysis data set, it's going to cost you 100 times the amount to correct it. And the same happens with our studies, right? If it's a clinical study that's monitored, it might cost us $1 per data element, if that, to put a rule on the screen to double check some ranges or validate the data when it's entered. It might cost us $10 or more. The average is $35 to $50 per query, actually, to correct a piece of data once it's been detected by one of those rules after the fact, after it's been entered and after the user's left the screen. And then it's going to cost us 100 times more to correct that piece of data if we have to put a clinical trial monitor on an airplane to go out to a site in order to retrieve the data or correct the data, or even just to correct it based on a simple query, but after the fact when we might have to regenerate the analysis data sets. So all of these fair things that we need to do with data, like documentation, like standards, like data quality, they are much, much less expensive if we plan them in and do them up front, which again, puts more pressure on us as researchers and research teams. So the next thing that I wanted to mention is the data repositories. A lot of those FAIR principles that I mentioned, I said something about putting the stake in the sand with the repositories. That's really critical because those expectations that NIH has set for repositories are really around those FAIR principles. So things like persistent identifiers, interoperability, making data reusable and findable on the web, those things are handled in large part by the repositories. Now, it means that we might have to supply them metadata, which is part of our burden of sharing the data, but those standards are really upheld by the repositories because those things are required of sharers in order to deposit data in a repository. So a student of mine in the last few months actually finished his dissertation on data sharing, and he's one of the associate CIOs of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And he did a survey of data sharing with the Department of Interior for all of their different divisions. And the one clear thing that he found in his dissertation is that the shared data met the FAIR principles at the level of rigor that was specified by the repository. Very few did more, but nobody could do less because that was a requirement for data sharing. So these repositories and their standards, this is where a lot of the FAIR principles get sort of set. And importantly, there are two types of repositories acknowledged by the NIH Data Management Sharing Plan. There's domain-specific repositories. If there is domain-specific repository for your research, then you really should share data there. And there's a list of them all on the website that NIH has, and you can find if there is one or not. If there's not a domain-specific one, then NIH has funded a group of generalist repositories where there aren't to be used where there aren't discipline-specific standards, and those are on the right-hand side of the slide. And NIH has been working for a few years with something called GRAY, or the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative. And this is where these generalist repositories have gotten together and tried to set common objectives and common standards for sharing of data. And the data repository that Dr. Schmelz mentioned, the Texas Digital Library, they use the product at the bottom left of the slide called Dataverse. It came out of Harvard. And so the Texas Digital Libraries host an instance of Dataverse. And so that is the generalist repository where if there isn't a domain-specific one, that because the VPR's office in our institution is joining Texas Digital Library, that our investigators can share their data there free, without additional cost to the investigator. And that, that's a help because some of these repositories, well, most of them are at least $500 per deposition. Usually there's a deposition per publication. And so those costs add up, especially if there's no additional money provided with the grant. So there are several things sort of in summary that the investigators need to do differently, including documentation, traceability, extra metadata and documenting metadata when they share, selecting repositories that meet the NIH requirements, and planning for data sharing up front. And most importantly, because I haven't mentioned patients yet in the discussion, the NIH policy explicitly requires that there be text about data sharing in the informed consent. And so in our templates that Dr. Schmelz mentioned that we provide investigators, we highlight that in there to investigators so that they remember after this is awarded 9 months down the road, when I'm working to get the informed consent document done, make sure I put the language in about data sharing. So now I want to talk specifically about the nuts and bolts of the policy and what it requires, just really briefly, but just so it's not so abstract to people. So when I think about the data management sharing policy, I think about peanut butter and jelly because it requires three things: a plan, a budget, and a justification. And those things are new for data management and sharing for NIH grants. The data management plan is not scored by reviewers. I usually say it's not seen by reviewers. Technically, it is in the packet. They could probably see it unless NIH does things differently with the way they organize the grant submission, so that prevents them from seeing it. But they do see the budget justification. And so if it's not looked at during the review, it's not scored, who sees it? Well, I mentioned earlier that the NIH program official reviews the data management plan before award and gives the investigator any questions or comments before the award. In addition, it's reviewed annually to make sure that the investigator is still adhering to the plan. And so investigators need support from the research team, not just initially to do the plan, but also throughout the life of the project to make sure that the plan and what's actually being done are consistent. The NIH policy articulates different components of a data management plan. So these are all the things that need to be required in it, including selection of the repository up front. Doesn't mean it can't change. It totally can change. But you have to show that you have a clue and you have to select an appropriate repository up front. This is an example. This is one of our templates. I think this is the clinical study that we did that have all the components of the data management sharing plan. Since this, we've also added a ton of instructions in gray italics to help investigators, as well as left the example language in there to help folks writing a plan. The NIH also has produced now 2 templates. There historically, for the last few months, has been a very generic one on the web with just kind of the headers, those 7 or 8 headers in it. But NIH has since, for the Federal Demonstration Project, created 2 different templates. One's a very structured template and the other allows for narrative text. And so we as an institution signed up for the pilot for the reasons that Dr. Schmelz mentioned. And so what we'll be doing is, and it may actually be on the web already, is there's a link to access the draft templates for the data management sharing plan. And if you click to access the templates, you're agreeing to be in the pilot. Exactly what that means is 2 things. It means that we're going to call you after your submission and after you've had a chance to get some sleep to ask you what your feedback is about the template that you chose and why you chose it. And do you have any comments about it or criticism? And then additionally, we're going to be reviewing, as a group of informaticists, we're going to be reviewing the actual data management sharing plans and the comments that come back at just in time before the award to see if the template that was used or if our services helped or not in decreasing the number of questions that come back at JIT with a data management and sharing plan. So we are definitely in a pilot, and you can be in the pilot too. The next thing that's required with the data management sharing plan is a detailed budget, and we've provided a budget cost calculator. This is actually on the CRI webpage, as well as the template for the budget justification. Those things underlined in black are the headings that are required to be in the paragraph of the budget justification, because NIH wants to see those broken out, those by cost area. I'm hopeful that looking at that for the first year or 2 will help NIH figure out a way to increase award amounts to cover that, but that's just me being hopeful. I have no real knowledge and certainly can't speculate on whether or not that will occur. We've mentioned a bunch of resources, both Dr. Schmelz and I. These are some links to them. If you forget all this and you have a question about either how to manage some data or how to do a data management sharing plan or how to share some data, you can email informatics@utusca.edu, and one of our clinical research informatics specialists will be happy to contact you. They do it pretty quickly, and they'll be able to get you to the right place and get help to you. We offer a bunch of data handling and management services, everything from queries on the data warehouse to self-service data queries that we can give you an account for, to help with REDCap, you setting up REDCap databases or setting them up for you, to advanced information systems and fully developed software applications. So anything involving data, give us a call, and I'd be happy for any questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Zozus, as well as Dr. Schmelz, for all of that wonderful information. A lot of stuff going on here as far as the NIH policy is concerned. And thank you for all of your hard work and the committee's hard work on getting all of this prepared for our researchers. I saw in the chat here that Dr. Roach had a couple of questions that I think we wanted to address. Dr. Roach, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your questions?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So let's see, the budgeting. So you're saying grant reviewers will see a detailed budget. So we're going to put into the budget all the costs that are necessary to do these things you've discussed. By the way, Meredith, your presentation was wonderful. You made a very strong case for the best practices of how to do this right.
Oh, thanks.
But the big concern is investigators are going to get left holding the bag. Like, you know, did we adequately budget? Did we adequately do this when it's time to share and post? Have we really resourced the cost of doing all that work? And
Yep.
and how is that going to eat into the total capped amount of the direct costs? So now there's less to do research.
Yeah, so you're totally correct. There is less to do research. And, you know, historically over the last 30 years, we've seen the expectations kind of ratcheting up, literally like a frog in boiled water on investigators for data management and handling. And the amount for the budget has not increased. Regarding your question about the budget, there I've put for the detailed form, it goes in one of these lines right here on the form, and then on the modular budget, the additional narrative justification goes here, and the amount is in the total. And OSP has done a bunch of these at this point and is available to help investigators with that. And the budget justification literally is a separate paragraph in each case. Did that get your question?
Yeah. So, but does your group provide consultation on really what are the human resources? Mm-hmm. What are the capital expenses? You know, yep. What are these costs? Because a lot of investigators don't have a sense of it.
Yep. So basically the policy says that costs incurred because you're sharing the data are what go into that category. And so we built an Excel spreadsheet budget calculator where the investigator can put in the roles that they're using and they've talked about in their research plan and their main budget. And then it goes through all of the activities as comprehensive as we could think about them that could be required for data management sharing, an example of metrics, so that they can say how many of them they need to do, i.e. how many sharings they're doing, and then how many hours per each. And our Chris's will go through and help them create that budget. And then it breaks it down in the categories so it can go right into the budget justification paragraph.
And then I actually had a separate question, which was, the fear that investigators have. I mean, the timing of this. I mean, you might be years doing a clinical trial, and as soon as it's done, or as soon as you try, you don't want to wait 3 or 4 or 5 years to publish your first publication, but you don't post the data till it's all done. So as soon as it's done, you got to post it and then start sharing it. And you haven't really had time yet to do all the analysis and all the publication.
So
That's a huge fear that investigators get scooped on their own data.
yeah, and it's not a totally unfounded fear, first of all, because there is pressure to share data sooner, especially some of the genomic data sets that could have discovery value. They want those suckers published within, several months, within completing the QC and QA on them, and which could be before publication easily. For regular data, what we've put in on all the ones that we've helped with so far is that the data will be shared at the time of publication. And because that's in the data management and sharing plan, the investigator has room to negotiate that with the program official if they have questions or comments at JIT. So if an investigator wanted to wait longer, like 6 months after publication because of additional analyses, that would be a legitimate request. And I would certainly advise them to put that in their data management and sharing plan and argue their strongest case with the program official for it.
And related to that, a lot of times, like you have like the main outcomes, the main a priori statistical plan. So you could do that first, publish that, and release that. And then there's like secondary variables and other things that would be followed up with later and subsequent publications. So in other words, you release your data sort of piecemeal.
Yep. And thanks for that comment, because that's a really important clarification point. What we've advised investigators to do are to share the data that support the primary analysis of the publication, not the full Monty, not the data from the 50-page case report form, but the data that support the analysis for the publication. So perfect point. I'm thrilled that you made it. The data should be shared in piecemeal. And if the data are handled well and shared well, joining back up for a larger data set for secondary use should be quite easy. Breege, I see your hand up.
So Meredith, I had like a similar kind of question. What I was thinking more for the basic science faculty who do research at the lab using animal work. Now, because of this NIH requirement, do we have to put every data, every Western blot, every image we took it here or no? That's my first question. No.
Yeah, definitely not. Although I will say the NIH is a little fuzzy on it. And so our research informaticists, we've all come from clinical research. And this first wave of doing these data management sharing plans was our first exposure to working with investigators who did animal studies and bench work. And so we are incredibly grateful to those individuals who taught us an awful lot about the variability and the different types of data that you guys work with and some of the differences between those types of studies and clinical studies with respect to data handling and sharing. And so, yeah, the NIH says that scientific data should be shared. And in the policy, there's a little language in there about data that support the primary analysis or the endpoints in the publication. And so in a lot of cases, it's really not the raw data that would be shared. It's the analysis data set type data. But I will say there's one really important exception. So there are data sets like genomic information or images where the information content in the data set goes far beyond what an investigator might be picking out for their specific analysis. So there are things like images and genetic information that NIH wants that raw data, once it's kind of past whatever QA, QC the investigator is going to do, wants that raw data shared because of the ability to squeeze so much more juice out of the information content. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that makes sense. But again, my question is that when let's suppose we are doing experiments in the lab and we do like 10 Western blot, but in the publication, we only put 1 Western blot. So when NIH looks at the data, do they want all those 10 Western blots or only the one which is already published?
That's up to you. And if they disagree with you, you get the opportunity to argue with them. But that's really up to the investigator to say what's relevant data to be shared.
And then who is normally policing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from the NIH perspective, it's the program official that reviews the data management and sharing plan on an annual basis. And I'm betting that these poor folks didn't get any more training in how to do this than our investigators. At the same time, the NIH policy requires, one of the sections in there is institutional oversight. And so the NIH policy requires institutional oversight. And so in the templates, we have a set paragraph that IRB and OSP and compliance worked on for us to put in. And it talks about the oversight at the time of submission to make sure that the data management sharing plan is there. And then the opportunity sort of ongoing if needed to look at those. And so there's that set paragraph that's there in the plan. And let me see if I'm going to see if I can make it big enough to put up.
Meredith, I just want to point out we're at 2 o'clock. So I think we're probably running out of time. We want to make sure that there's no other urgent questions, that we could take this conversation offline, perhaps.
Yep. And so I'll put that up while we get the next question, but this is the language.
Are you going to share the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Sure, I will. And actually I didn't, that's an old version of the template. So I'll put the new version of the template with the right language in there.
And does this only apply to studies with NIH funding?
So for the NIH data management and sharing plan, yes. However, other funders also have their own. I've looked at them from the congressionally directed medical research projects. I've looked at them from NSF and some foundations. And the important thing is all of those different funders all have different requirements for the data management sharing plan. They're not completely unrelated. And so we're happy if you have some odd funder or foundation that has one, we're happy to help interpret that with you and put that together and or talk to the program official with you and get it clarified if clarification is needed.
All right. Well, great job, Meredith. Thank you so much for sharing good information with everyone. Hope everyone got some pearls of wisdom from today's webinar, but certainly reach out to everyone as necessary going forward. Thanks everyone so much for attending today's webinar.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Have a good
you.
afternoon.
Can I